entre par les vitraux brisés, et nos voix montent comme un seul souffle.
When people think of Notre-Dame, they often picture the same things: the two great towers, the stained glass, the gargoyles watching over Paris, or the fire in 2019 when the roof burned and the spire collapsed in front of the whole world. But the story of Notre-Dame begins long before any of that. It begins with a small island in the Seine, a growing medieval city, and a group of people who decided to build something far larger than anything they would ever see finished in their own lifetimes. Construction began in 1163. That means Notre-Dame de Paris was started more than 850 years ago. At the time, Paris was not the polished city people imagine today. It was smaller, noisier, dirtier, and crowded around the river. Streets were narrow, markets were packed. The smell of smoke, mud, food, waste, and people would have been everywhere. At the center of it all was the Île de la Cité, a small island in the Seine. This island was the heart of Paris. It was where religion, politics, trade, and city life came together. There had already been churches on the island before Notre Dame. One of them was dedicated to Saint Stephen. But by the 1100s, Paris was changing. More people were coming to the city. There were more traders, more priests, and more workers. The old church no longer matched the city around it. Paris needed a cathedral that showed what the city was becoming. That is where Bishop Maurice de Sully enters the story. Maurice de Sully was the Bishop of Paris. Around 1160, he began planning a new cathedral. He wanted to replace the older church with a building that could serve the city, represent the power of the church, and show the importance of Paris. The cathedral would be dedicated to the Virgin Mary. That is why it is called Notre-Dame. Notre-Dame means Our Lady. From the beginning, the building had more than one purpose. It was a place of worship, but it was also a message. It told anyone entering Paris that this city mattered. It had faith, it had power, it had ambition. The first stone was laid in 1163. Some traditions say Pope Alexander III was present. Whether or not every detail of that story is certain, it shows how important the project was believed to be. But one of the most interesting things about Notre-Dame is what we do not know. We do not know the name of the first architect. One of the most famous buildings in the world was first designed by someone whose name has disappeared. That tells us a lot about the Middle Ages. Today, famous architects can become celebrities. Their names are attached to museums, skyscrapers, stadiums, and monuments. But medieval cathedrals were different. They were seen as works for God, the church, and the city. Thousands of people worked on Notre Dame. Most of their names were never written down. Masons cut stone, carpenters shaped timber, sculptors carved saints, kings, monsters, faces, and scenes from the Bible. Laborers carried materials, climbed scaffolds, and worked in dangerous conditions. And the building kept rising. The builders did not begin with the famous front towers. They started at the opposite end, in the east, around the altar. This part of the cathedral is called the choir. In a cathedral, the choir is not only a place for singing, it is the sacred area near the main altar, where the most important religious services took place. Starting there made sense. If the choir could be completed first, priests could begin using that part of the cathedral while the rest of the building was still under construction. From about 1163 to 1182, workers built the choir and the walkways around it, called ambulatories. An ambulatory is a passage that lets people move around the altar area without disturbing the service. Pilgrims and worshippers could pass through, pray, and move around the sacred space, while clergy continued their work. The choir was built from east to west. First came the curved outer wall at the back of the cathedral. Then came the rows of interior supports. These supports carried the weight of the upper walls, the vaults, and the roof above. Even in this first stage, the ambition was clear. The builders were not making a low, dark church. They were reaching upward. They wanted height. They wanted space. They wanted light. But stone is heavy, and height is dangerous. Every arch, column, wall, and support had to work with the others. If the pressure moved in the wrong direction, the structure could crack or collapse. By around 1177, the wooden roof over the choir was probably already in place. Soon after, stone vaults were built beneath it. The roof helped protect the vaults while construction continued. Once the choir was closed off, likely with a temporary wall, services could begin inside. So Notre-Dame was not silent while it was being built. It was alive before it was complete. In one part of the cathedral, priests prayed and worshippers gathered. In another part, workers were still cutting stone, lifting beams, and raising walls. After the choir, construction moved west. The next major section was the nave. The nave is the long central space where ordinary worshippers would stand or sit. It is the body of the church. When most people imagine the inside of a cathedral with columns stretching forward and the ceiling high above, they are usually imagining the nave. From about 1182 to 1190, the first 4 bays of the nave were built. A bay is one section of the building, almost like one slice of the cathedral. Medieval builders worked section by section. Each part had to line up with the next. The columns, arches, galleries, windows, and vaults all had to connect. If one part was slightly wrong, the mistake could travel through the structure. The nave shows how medieval construction was both planned and flexible. The builders had an overall direction, but they also adjusted as they went. As construction continued, new ideas entered the project. Gothic architecture was developing quickly. Builders across northern France were experimenting with taller walls, larger windows, pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. Notre-Dame became part of that experiment. The builders learned from what had already been built. Later generations looked at the work before them and changed it. They made the cathedral taller, brighter, and more open. Around 1200, work began on the western front. This is the face of Notre-Dame that most people recognize today. It has 3 great doorways, a row of kings, a large rose window, and the 2 towers above. But the towers did not come first. The lower parts of the front were built before the upper towers were finished. The 3 great portals were more than entrances. They were carved sermons. Most ordinary people in the Middle Ages could not read. Books were rare, expensive, and usually controlled by religious institutions or wealthy people, so churches taught through images. The front of Notre-Dame became a kind of stone lesson. One portal showed scenes connected to St. Anne, another honored the Virgin Mary. The central portal showed the Last Judgment, with Christ judging the living and the dead. To a medieval visitor, these sculptures were not just decoration. They showed heaven, hell, mercy, and salvation. Before a person even stepped inside, the building was already speaking to them. It reminded them of sin, judgment, hope, and eternity. Today, much of the stone looks gray and bare, but in the Middle Ages, many sculptures and surfaces would have been painted. Medieval cathedrals were often full of color. Statues could be painted, walls could be painted. Glass filled the interior with red, blue, purple, green, and gold light. Notre-Dame would not have felt cold and empty. From about 1225 to 1250, the upper part of the western front and the 2 towers were built. The towers made Notre-Dame visible across Paris. Most buildings in the medieval city were small compared with the cathedral. When the towers rose above the rooftops, they changed the skyline. They announced the presence of the church from far away. But even then, Notre-Dame was still changing. The cathedral was already impressive, but by the early 1200s, other Gothic churches were becoming brighter and more open. Builders at places like Chartres and Reims were using larger windows and more dramatic effects of light. Notre-Dame's builders wanted the same kind of transformation, so they changed the upper walls. They enlarged the high windows. They removed smaller round openings. They simplified parts of the interior elevation from a 4-level design into a clearer 3-level design: arcade, gallery, and clear story. The arcade is the lower level of arches. The gallery is the level above it. The clear story is the upper part of the wall, where high windows bring light into the building. These changes altered the feeling of the interior. More light could enter. The cathedral moved closer to the Gothic style people imagine today: tall, bright, and filled with colored glass. Between the 1220s and the middle of the 1200s, side chapels were added between the buttresses. These chapels gave the cathedral more space. They could be used for prayers, tombs, private services, and devotion to particular saints. But adding chapels also changed the shape of the building. The outside walls expanded. The cathedral became wider and more complex. Because of that, the transepts also became more important. The transepts are the arms of the cross-shaped plan. They extend to the north and south. Around 1240, a master mason named Jean de Chelles worked on the north transept. His work included the Great North Rose Window. Around the same period, Notre-Dame also gained its first central spire above the crossing, where the nave and transept meet. This spire rose during the age of the Great Transept rebuilding, but it is not usually credited directly to Jean de Chelles. Later, Pierre de Montreuil worked on the south transept, including the south facade and its rose window. These later sections were built in a style called Rayonnant Gothic. Rayonnant means radiating. The name fits the rose windows. Their stone tracery spreads outward from the center like rays. Notre Dame has 3 famous rose windows. One on the west front, one on the north side, and one on the south side. When sunlight passes through them, the building changes. Stone becomes colored. The air becomes tinted. Gothic builders used light as part of the religious experience. They wanted the church to feel connected to something beyond ordinary life. The height, the glass, the music, and the images all worked together. Around 1300, work continued around the choir. More chapels were added. Larger windows were inserted. The area around the altar became brighter and more decorated. By then, Notre Dame had been under construction for more than a century. Different generations had worked on it. Different builders had made decisions. Some parts were medieval from the first campaign. Others were later additions. Some parts had already been changed before the whole building was even considered finished. That is one of the most important things to understand about Notre Dame. One generation began the work, another continued it, another changed it, another added to it. The cathedral became a record of time. To build something like this, the workers needed enormous amounts of material. The main stone was limestone, much of it taken from quarries around Paris. Some came from underground quarries beneath the city. Stone had to be cut from the quarry, moved to the building site, shaped, lifted, and placed. Transport was one of the biggest challenges. Medieval streets were narrow and difficult, especially for heavy materials. The Seine made the work easier. Stone, timber, and other supplies could be moved by boat along the river and brought close to the site. Once the stone arrived, masons shaped it by hand. They used hammers, chisels, and careful geometry. A cathedral depended on accuracy. Every stone belonged to a larger system of pressure and support. Workers climbed high above the ground. Stones were lifted with ropes, pulleys, winches, and wooden cranes. Some lifting machines used a giant wooden wheel. A person walked inside the wheel, like a hamster. As the wheel turned, it pulled a rope and lifted heavy stone. Notre Dame also used iron in important ways. Hidden inside parts of the stonework were iron cramps and clamps. These helped hold stones together, almost like metal stitches. Modern research after the 2019 fire showed that iron was used very early in Notre Dame's construction, not only added later. That makes the cathedral especially interesting to historians and engineers. It shows that medieval builders were willing to combine materials in sophisticated ways. They were not simply stacking stone. Above the stone vaults was the wooden roof structure. This roof later became known as the forest because it used so many oak beams. Each major beam came from a tree. The amount of timber required was enormous. Below that roof were the stone vaults. The pointed arches helped direct weight downward. The ribbed vaults carried the ceiling. The columns carried the weight below. The flying buttresses caught the outward push from the upper walls and vaults, then sent that force down into the ground. A flying buttress looks delicate from a distance, but it performs a serious structural job. Without supports like these, the walls could not be so high or hold such large windows. The beauty of Gothic architecture comes from this balance. A cathedral required money, organization, and cooperation across the city. The church played a major role, but gifts and donations mattered too. Wealthy people could support chapels, decoration, or construction. Ordinary people contributed in smaller ways. The building was tied to the pride of Paris. A great cathedral showed faith, but it also showed status. Paris wanted to stand among the major cities of Europe. Notre-Dame helped it do that. The cathedral became one of the largest and most impressive religious buildings of its time. It was a place for worship, but it was also a stage for important events. In 1239, King Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, brought holy relics connected to the Passion of Christ into Paris. These relics were first received at Notre-Dame before being placed in Sainte-Chapelle. That moment shows the position Notre-Dame had gained. It was a place where religion, monarchy, and the identity of France could meet. Over the centuries, Notre-Dame became tied to the history of the country. But it also suffered. During the French Revolution, many people attacked symbols of kingship and the old church. Notre-Dame was damaged, statues were broken, the heads of the kings on the front of the cathedral were destroyed, because revolutionaries thought they represented French kings. They were actually biblical kings of Judah. The cathedral survived the revolution, but it was badly damaged and neglected. Around the same period, Notre-Dame also lost its original medieval spire. This first spire had stood above the crossing since the Middle Ages, but by the late 1700s, it was in poor condition and was taken down. The rest of the cathedral was not in much better shape. By the early 1800s, Notre-Dame was worn down, damaged, and no longer loved the way it is today. To many people, it was simply an old building in a changing city. Then Victor Hugo published The Hunchback of Notre-Dame in 1831. The novel changed how people saw the cathedral. Hugo made Notre-Dame feel alive again in the public imagination. He showed it as more than old stone. He presented it as a witness to history, a symbol of Paris, and a work of art worth saving. The book helped build support for restoration. In the 1800s, a major restoration began. The most famous architect involved was Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. He restored and redesigned parts of the cathedral, and he added the spire that later became one of Notre-Dame's most recognizable features. That spire was not medieval, it was a 19th century creation. The same is true for some of the creatures people associate with Notre-Dame. Many people call them gargoyles, but not all of them are. A true gargoyle is a waterspout. Its job is to throw rainwater away from the walls so the stone does not erode as quickly. A chimera is different. It is a decorative monster or creature. One of the most famous is often called Le Strige. It sits high above Paris, resting its head in its hands, looking out over the city like it is bored, tired, or lost in thought. That image is famous now, but it belongs to the 1800s restoration, not the original 1100s cathedral. Then, on April 15, 2019, the world watched Notre-Dame burn. For many people, the site felt impossible. Notre-Dame had survived wars, revolution, neglect, pollution, restoration, and centuries of change. Suddenly, it seemed fragile. But the stone vaults helped protect much of the interior. The tower survived, the main structure survived, the rose windows survived. Experts studied the surviving structure, old drawings, photographs, laser scans, fallen stones, burned wood, metal fittings, and construction marks. They examined materials that had been hidden for centuries. In a strange way, the fire revealed parts of Notre-Dame that historians had never been able to study so closely. Scientists learned more about the stone, the iron, the wood, and the methods used by medieval builders. The disaster became a chance to understand the cathedral better, but the central story of Notre-Dame remains the medieval one. The people who began Notre-Dame knew they would probably never see it finished, but each person contributed to something larger than themselves. It matters because it shows what human beings can do when they believe a project is worth more than their own lifetime. Notre-Dame began as stone on a small island in medieval Paris. Over time, it became a church, a work site, a ruin, a restoration project, and a survivor. It has been changed by builders, worshippers, kings, and revolutionaries. It has never belonged to only one moment.
Et si la nuit nous cerne, tiens nos voix levées dans la cendre.
And even after fire, damage, and time, the idea behind it remains. Some things are worth building, even if you never see the end.
Kyrie, prends pitié, Kyrie, prends pitié, nous voici devant toi.